All right, AP Govers, it is Tuesday, April 14th, and we're going to get straight to things as quickly as I can here, but just a couple simple reminders first. All right, this is our second week of review of 5 weeks of review. Last week we focused upon Unit 1. All right, all of those documents should have been submitted if you have me this semester, all right, for the course. All right, this week I will be putting in your classwork folder a Unit 2 review document. You're to do the same thing with it. Complete that document and submit it to me, but before we start Unit 3's review next week, all right, on next Tuesday on the 20th. As a gentle reminder, over these first 3 weeks, we'll cover the reviews for each one of the units that is covered on the AP exam. It is your responsibility to be the master of this material. All right, I will after these 3 weeks, I will spend 1 week on a concept application FRQ and then 1 week on the argumentative FRQ. Knowing how to handle those FRQs is worthless if you do not know the material. So you have to go through, do these reviews, look them over, do my practice quizzes that I'm putting at the end of each week. I know those things are optional, but they're really critical for your success and knowledge of the material. So try to stay focused and keep working on those things. So without further ado, let's get right to the Unit 2. All right, you'll see the Unit 2 interactions among the government branches. All right, we're going to focus today on the legislative branch. On Thursday, I will do the material for the judicial and the executive branches of government. Much of the material, I think, in this legislative branch unit is simple kind of stuff. All right, if I'm going too fast, always just kind of pause and go back. All right, and so the first question says, how does the Constitution reflect the Senate represents equality while the House is designed to represent population? I'm going to go to, and probably just one time here today, go to the document itself. All right, if we look at Section 2, where it introduces the House, it says the following. Representative and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this unit according to their respective numbers. All right, we create the House to represent population. You get the more population you have, the more membership you have in the United States House of Representatives based upon that information. In Section 3 of Article 1, the Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state. So there's 2 per state, so that's where we get our equality idea from the United States Senate. That makes the people from New Jersey happy. The United States House makes the people from Virginia happy, if we kind of go back to the plans from Unit 1. When we talk about reapportionment, what it is and how it happens for question 2, reapportionment is the redistribution of House seats amongst the states based upon their populations. Right? We do that every 10 years. All right. The United States Census Bureau conducts a census every 10 years. They take those numbers and then apportion the 435 seats amongst the 50 states based upon their populations. All right. So in theory, we're going to get the census conducted this year, 2020. That will then affect the election of 2022, and then we'll do the same thing in 2030, affecting the 2032 election, et cetera, with that decennial census. From the reapportionment, we work to then the state level. The states are told how many House districts they have, right? And it's their then job to redistrict those districts within their own state. They have to redistricting is a drawing of the boundaries of the House districts based upon the number of seats you have. And so if you're given a new number, obviously you've got to redraw the districts because you've got more or fewer House reps than you did 10 years ago. But sometimes even if you have the same number of House reps, you have to redraw the districts because the population within your state has shifted. Right? Again, that is done by the state legislature. If your party's in charge of the state legislature, that party, your party, has basically control over every single district and who lives within a district. That can become problematic in regard to the process of gerrymandering. Question 4, if we remember, gerrymandering is a process of drawing district lines that favor one political party over another. And by knowing an individual's demographic traits and a community's demographic traits, we really can determine the outcome of elections, because if we put more Republicans within a district than Democrats, then we know the Republican candidate, no matter who he or she is probably going to win that election. And with science and technology today, it's really easy to gerrymander districts to determine the outcome of election before an election has ever happened. And so, unfortunately, if we kind of think of question 4 and 5 together, all right, gerrymandering really has a major influence upon the outcome of elections in the United States of America today, because we know voting habits and we have that data, and technology makes it determine outcomes. Skipping all the way to question 6 then, right? There are 435 members in the United States House. There are 100 members in the United States Senate. If you're confused where the number 100 comes from the United States Senate, please talk to Hugh and Leo. They're my math guys, and they can help you figure out where that number and how that number is calculated. When we look at the sizes of the chambers, and one of the most common conversations within the AP world is, how does the size of these chambers sometimes affect the formality of the procedures that each respective body follows? The House, as a much larger body, right, with 4 times the size of the United States Senate, because of those extensive numbers, right, they are much more dependent upon a formal process. Right? They're much more dependent upon party leadership to determine the actions of the members themselves, and what the members do is much more kind of connected with process, and leadership. On the other hand, the Senate, as a smaller body, they embrace a much higher level of informality. The members themselves have a greater sense of independence. They're less connected and dependent upon the leadership to tell them what to do. And so the size dramatically affects the process that is followed in each body. All right, moving on to question 8. If you are elected to the House, of course, you serve a 2-year term, and if you are elected to the Senate, you serve a 6-year term. Now, with those different term lengths, right, coalitions of voting, right, can be affected. So when we talk about a coalition of voters within a legislative body itself, all right, generally we're talking about, first off, we would talk about coalitions of voters. We could talk about, right, Democrats getting together and Republicans getting together, but we could also be talking about other little groups within here. Right? If you remember, members of Congress have their own little caucuses, which are like interest groups within Congress themselves, and some of these different groups, right, kind of band with other groups within Congress to help push legislation that's beneficial to all of them, or at least to all of the groups that kind of come together within these coalitions. The coalitions in the United States Senate tend to be stronger, right, because they have longer tenures in office. They're serving 6-year terms, and so it's okay sometimes as a senator if you make a decision that makes your constituents upset, because you might have 5 more years before the next election. In the House, those coalitions, they're more tenuous. They're more likely to get fragmented because all of the members are always concerned about the next election. And so if they do something, if they're afraid to do something that might upset their constituents, or even the party leadership, right, they don't want to step onto that ground, and so those coalitions can kind of fall apart much quicker in the House than they do in the center and in the Senate. When we look at the House and the Senate, we also can see that they specialize in different areas. The House specializes really in appropriations or spending bills. All bills that spend money have to go to the House before they can even be considered by the Senate. Right? Another area of specialization that we saw this semester is, we know the United States House is responsible for the impeachment itself of the United States president. And so they're in charge of conducting the investigation, of determining whether or not an official like the president, all right, should be impeached. And so that's what the House focuses upon. They've got that first step of the impeachment process, and they are the spending capital, all right, of the legislative branch. And our founding fathers gave the House this specialty because they recognized that originally the House was the only body that was elected by the people, and it's the people's money, so we're going to give them this power. On the other hand, some of the powers and the things that the Senate specializes in, right, is the Senate specializes really in foreign relations, right? They have the power to approve treaties, all right? They have the power to approve presidential appointments. Oftentimes those appointments are, or many of the important ones or significant ones, are foreign relations in nature. And And so those are a couple of things that the Senate specializes in. The Senate also, in terms of the impeachment process, the Senate is the group that conducts a trial for impeachment to determine whether or not someone is guilty or not guilty of the impeachment charges that would have come from the House. And so they have the second step of that process. All right. If we look at question 12, if we look at Article 1 again, and I'm not going to get into this a lot because this was part of Unit 1 itself, so I'm not going to show you these highlighted parts of the Constitution again. Remember, those enumerated powers are those powers that are specifically listed, okay? And so I'll give you a few of them that you should remember off the top of your head. They shouldn't need any definitions for you. All right, Congress has the power to tax. Congress has the power to regulate commerce between the states and between foreign nations. Congress has the power to declare war. Those are enumerated. They're specifically listed in the first clauses within Article 1, Section 8. Right? Then again, in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, we find the necessary and proper clause. This clause results in implied powers for Congress. Again, we talked about this last week. Right? The implied powers allows Congress to increase those enumerated powers because they're given flexibility in regards to what they can do with those things. Okay. Moving on to 2.2 and question 14. Question 14 asks you to describe what the policymaking process is. And I think we went through this process first semester. I don't know if we did this, this activity in class second semester, talked about this. And so I've got kind of step 1 and an arrow to step 2. Right? So the way the policymaking system works, if you kind of pay attention to my notes, everything in theory within the American democracy, Abraham Lincoln defined democracy, government of the people, by the people, for the people. And so everything in regards to how policy is created, it's about the people. It begins and ends with the people. And so does our policymaking system. And so what happens in theory within our policymaking system is the people have some kind of concern or problem that they need addressed by the system itself. And so what people do is they reach out to linkage institutions. When we're talking about linkage institutions, a linkage institution connects a person or groups of people, right, with those on the inside that can do something about their problem or their concern. And so we talk about linkage institutions, we talk about elections, political parties, the media, and interest groups. These are different entities that can help take your problem and get it inside the system. Right? Once those linkage institutions get your problem inside the system, your problem becomes part of the policy agenda. Now that's great. So it's on the list excuse me, of things that the system in theory might take a look at, but it's critical that where its placement on the policy agenda. If it's important enough, those policy-making institutions within the system, all right, the 3 branches of government and the federal bureaucracy, those policy-making institutions will take a look at that issue, that political issue. All right, now it's not just a problem, it's a political issue on the policy agenda. And they may craft policy out of that issue, right? Sometimes that policy might be, they decide, you know what we're going to do about this problem? We're going to do nothing at all, right? But oftentimes they might pass a law. That law could be about increasing taxes or decreasing taxes. It might be increasing regulations, maybe further protections for healthcare workers. Who knows what it's going to be? But that policy is created, and then that policy goes back and it affects the people. All right, that's how policy affects people. Sometimes it affects them in a positive way. Sometimes people are negatively affected, and the whole system gets going again and again. So that's the policy-making system. All right. When we look at that policy-making process, there are some things that happen in the House and the Senate, right, that are a little bit different. And I highlighted these earlier in some previous conversations, but just kind of know this, that the major difference in policymaking in the House compared to the Senate is the House is much more formal. The House is much more dependent upon the leadership within that body from each party, whether it's the majority party or the minority party, than the Senate. All right, the Senate, you've got the power to filibuster that dramatically affects the policy-making process also, and it can slow it down within the Senate. That kind of thing can't happen within the United States House of Representatives. Right? Moving on to question 16, it asks, what roles do committees play in Congress? Committees are where most of all the work in Congress really gets accomplished. Committees are conducting hearings for the bills. All right, they're conducting oversight of what's going on. for bills that have already been passed. Committees are the engine of Congress, right? And some of those committees are referred to as standing committees, as they ask about in question 17. All right, a standing committee is a permanent committee in Congress, all right? And so every body of Congress, every body of Congress has somewhere between like 17 and 20 standing committees or permanent committees where they have individual areas of specialization that if a bill comes in and it's dealing with, let's say, for example, like in the House, it's dealing with taxes, it's going to go to the House Ways and Means Committee. The Ways and Means Committee deals with all bills, all right, that come into the House that are tax related. The Appropriations Committee of the United States House, another standing committee, they screen all bills that are spending bills. They start there. A couple of the committees in the United States Senate that are critically important and powerful are going back to kind of their area of specialization. The Senate Armed Services Committee and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee are two powerful standing committees that really have a significant impact upon the United States around the world and seem to increase the prestige of the persons that sit and serve on those committees. Right. Another type of committee that exists in the United States Senate or other types of committees are select committees. A select committee is a temporary committee, a committee that's created for some kind of special purpose. Right. For example, right, we create a select committee to investigate Russian meddling in the 2016 election. Right. They do all their investigations, they release the report, right, and then that committee doesn't need to exist. Right. Bill Clinton has an affair in the 1990s that we put, and he lies about that affair. We put a committee together. They investigate what's going on. They release some information. And then there's no need to have that committee to continue to exist. That's what select committees do. All right, they're created for a special temporary purpose. Another type of committee that you should remember from our bill to law process is a conference committee. A conference committee is a joint committee. It has people from the House and the Senate on the same committee. And their job as part of the lawmaking process is to iron out differences between the House version of a bill as opposed to a Senate version of a bill. Right? If they can come to some kind of compromise, that bill, all right, that newly revised bill continues along in the process. If the conference committee can't come to a compromise, the bill dies within that process. And so we've got lots of different things in here in this table that influence policy making itself within the House, the Senate, or both of them. And so we've got titles of people. We have different traits that happen are associated with specific bodies of Congress. So without further ado, let's go to item 20 here, the Speaker of the House. In simple terms, just know the Speaker of the House is the presiding officer of the United States House of Representatives, and he or she is selected by the majority party that controls that body. The Speaker of the House only exists in the House, of course. All right, he or she, this is the most powerful member of Congress. They determine which bills go to which committees, which bills are actually going to be assigned. Without a doubt, all right, this position is incredibly powerful. Right. On the other hand, the presiding officer of the United States Senate is referred to as the President of the Senate. That individual is the Vice President of the United States, and so the President of the Senate only exists within the Senate, kind of like the Speaker only exists in the House, right? The President of the Senate, though, has very little impact upon policy. All right, he or she would only have the power to vote in case of a tie, and does not have the type of power like the Speaker does in regards to assigning bills to committees, determining the agenda and the direction of the body itself in any way similar form as within the House. All right, committee leadership, item number 22. All right. All committees know this, all right? All the committees, whether they're standing, select, all right, conference, whatever, all conference can become complicated, so let's just think standing and select. All committees are chaired by a member of the majority party. And so the majority party itself chooses who they want to be the chairperson of every single committee, all right? And this happens both in the House and the Senate. If you are a committee chairperson, you have an extraordinary amount of power about the procedures that committee is going to follow, right? The agenda that committee is going to create for its own actions. And so those committee chairs are very powerful individuals also in regards to leadership within the Congress itself. Item number 23 and 24 are connected with each other. We've got a filibuster and cloture. These things only happen within the Senate, right? A filibuster is delaying a bill for a vote through some kind of extended debate. It slows the policy-making process, obviously. oftentimes preventing controversial bills from coming to the floor for a vote, right, because you can't force a senator to stop their debate unless, item 24, you can get a vote of cloture passed. A vote of cloture is a 3/5 vote in the Senate to end a filibuster. Right? This is the only way to end the filibuster, and this is an attempt to get speed up and to get the policymaking process moving again. Another topic that is exclusive to the House are items 25 and 26 here. Right? Exclusive to the Senate. Right? In the Senate, the senators are able to put a hold on a bill. Basically, a hold on a bill is a procedure that allows a senator to tell the majority party leader, hey, if you don't put a hold on this bill, if you don't stop this bill, prevent it from coming to the floor for discussion right now, I'm going to filibuster it once it gets there. So it's this threat of the filibuster through this hold that dramatically slows down the process. It's a warning to the majority leader that a filibuster is coming, and so they just want to stop it before it ever gets to that point. And oftentimes, the majority leader, right, they will respect the minority party member wishes in some situations because they don't want to slow down the process, and they'll allow the hold to take place, and they'll find some other way to eventually appease those members who are upset and then bring the bill to the floor later. Unanimous consent also exists in the Senate. It's a process in the Senate, in which they can expedite the legislative process, all right? And so what they do is they get all the members to come in, and if all the members, all right, this happened during the recent pandemic, where if all the members agree, hey, let's expedite the process, let's get rid of some of the formality and some of the rules of the process so we can do this faster. If everybody agrees, all right, it can really speed up the process with unanimous consent. Right? Sometimes when there's only one member who refuses to consent to the expedited process, it throws the train off the tracks and it slows down the process again. All right. The next couple items, 27 and 28, are things that are associated exclusively with the United States House, and so we've got a Rules Committee and the Committee of the Whole. Right? A Rules Committee is part of the legislative process. Rules Committee, after a bill gets out of a standing committee, the Rules Committee's job is to schedule a bill for debate, to put it on the calendar, a specific date and time, determine the length of debate, the rules for amendments that could or could not be proposed as part of that process. Sometimes the Rules Committee could potentially kill the policymaking process by refusing to place a bill upon the calendar or coming up with restrictions upon the debate itself, the amendment process within the debate, that makes it a situation where nobody wants to vote on a bill if it gets to the floor anyway. Also in the House, they can meet kind of as a committee of the whole. This is a meeting of the entire membership of the U.S. House with less formal rules on debate, right? So usually members of the House are severely restricted in regards to how long they can talk about some kind of bill. The committee of the whole is a less formal structure where they all get together and they put aside some of the formality of the rules. Sometimes this helps bring guidance to policy direction and allows for more open discussion about topics. The last thing in the table is a discharge petition. Discharge petition could take place in either the House or the Senate. Discharge petitions are a vote of a majority of the body of either body of Congress to force a bill out of committee. If one of the committees is trying to bury the bill, or if you remember the phrase pigeonhole a bill in committee, if the rest of the membership wants that bill to come out for them to take a look at, they can pass a discharge petition. This could speed up the policymaking process if the committees are being too slow. Okay, moving off of the table on to question 30 here. Congress and their role within the federal budget. Congress's main role when it comes to the federal budget is to approve the president's budget proposal. Now, there's a lot of give and take in this. The president submits his budget proposal to Congress usually in February. It doesn't get officially proposed usually until October of that year, is when it's going to kind of be proposed. And so there's a months-long process where members of Congress get the president's budget proposal. They send it to their bureaucratic agency, the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, to look over the numbers and the presidential projections. They might end up with different numbers themselves, and they might want to make some changes to that bill. And so the White House oftentimes is working with congressional leadership to modify and to make changes to the budget so it can be passed when brought up for a vote. Okay. within the spending element of any budget, you have two types of spending. Okay, you have what is known as discretionary spending, and you have what is known as mandatory spending. Discretionary spending is spending that Congress has the ability to increase, decrease, or eliminate altogether. It is completely optional. It's up to them. All right. The greatest example of that is the spending for the Defense Department. We'll get back to that in a couple questions here. On the other hand, mandatory spending, all right, is spending on programs, sometimes referred to as entitlement programs, many of them, because people are legally entitled to some type of benefit that the government is supposed to provide. And so the government doesn't have, Congress doesn't have a choice of whether they want to spend money on, example, for Social Security or Medicare, because the law says that people have to be given Social Security benefits, they have to be given Medicare benefits. So those are mandatory spending programs. When it comes to discretionary spending, the largest discretionary spending element by far is our defense or military budget. Over the half of our discretionary spending that we have control over goes to the United States military. Looking at the budget itself, all right, typically every year in the United States of America, except for a couple years in the 1990s when Bill Clinton was president, we have had a budget deficit. A deficit is when we look at any single year, and in that year, the government spends more money than they bring in through revenue. All right, that is a deficit. On the other hand, and this isn't part of the question for question 34, but I want you to make sure that you know this term. When we talk about the federal debt, the debt is a cumulative amount of money that we owe in regards to or because of previous deficits that have never been repaid. The United States owes over $20 trillion as part of our debt because of all these deficits that we've had pretty much every year since World War II. Now, when you think about simple budgetary impacts, if the federal government decides to reduce taxes on people, what that means is that we're going to bring in less revenue. If spending maintains the same, as it usually does, all right, or incrementally increases, all right, then if you decrease taxes, you are going to have a larger deficit on a year-to-year basis, and you are going to increase the national debt. And so lowering taxes will grow the deficit for that single year most of the time. The next box here deals with congressional types of behaviors, all right, and so let's move on to question 36 here. And so as we look at Congress itself, sometimes we end up with, all the time, we end up with ideological divisions. And those ideological divisions are usually represented by Democrats and Republicans being on different sides and seeing things differently from each other. But we can also look within the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, and recognize that some people are more liberal or conservative than their fellow party members, right? The more division ideologically there is with the Congress, the slower policy is going to be created, the more difficulty we're going to have in governing our nation, the more division that exists. Right? Whenever they use the phrase divided government refers, generally speaking, to a situation in which one party controls the White House and the other party controls Congress. Again, if you have that divided government between the parties, you're going to have more difficulty in governing. You're going to have a slower policy-making process. You also might refer to a divided government as having a situation like we have now, where one party controls one body of Congress and the other party controls the other. It also makes the governing process slow because sometimes those parties don't want to work together, as we see all the time. Item 38 gets us to lame duck sessions, which also slows down and make the governing process more difficult. A lame duck session or a lame duck president, right, is a period of time in between a presidential election. All right, so like the presidential election, let's say in this November of 2020, Donald Trump loses the election in November of 2020. He will be in office until January 20th, when Joe Biden, all right, potentially would become the next president of the United States. That time period from November until January 20th would be referred to as a lame duck session. It would be extraordinarily difficult for Trump to get anything done if he was president during that window of time. Just like it was difficult for Obama during his last few months, even though he didn't run for re-election because he couldn't, those 3 months, he wasn't getting much accomplished because the members of Congress are already looking forward to and thinking about the next presidency and what's going to be on the next agenda. All right, the last few items for the day. If a member of Congress is a trustee, he or she will vote in whatever way they think is best. All right, they don't consult the party, they don't consult their constituents, they do what they think is best. All right. On the other hand, if an individual is a delegate, item number 40, as a delegate, if I'm a member of Congress that I'm a delegate, I see myself as a representative of my constituents. And so when I vote the way I think they would want me to vote. Okay, and that's what a delegate does. The difference between that and the next term here is a politico. A politico is a combination of motivations in regards to voting habits. So one day they might do what their constituents want. One day they might trust themselves. Oftentimes they might do whatever the party wants. And so a politico is just kind of a combination of a delegate, a trustee, a partisan member of Congress. Put those things together, you get a politico. All right, some of the last few things that we have here deal with a couple of required court cases. And so the first couple here are Baker versus Carr. All right, and so the facts of the case, what was going on in Baker? Baker, when you think about facts, you could think really small, people, if you're going to come up with lists and point things within an FRQ item if it's brought up in this manner. All right, Baker takes place in the state of Tennessee. All right, a citizen of Tennessee is suing the state because they have not redrawn their districts in over 60 years. All right, it's 1960s. They haven't redrawn the districts since the census of 1900. As a result, some districts, one of the facts of the case, some districts had 10 times the population than other districts have. All right. Now, what makes Baker versus Carr and the precedent of this case so significant is this was the first time the United States Supreme Court had looked at the issue of drawing districts and decided that this was at sometimes the drawing of legislative districts could be not just a political question where it's parties kind of fighting and they like to stay out of it, but they said with Baker versus Carr, this is a justiciable dispute. This is one that can be legally settled through the courts, and then so subsequent court rulings ruled that what Tennessee was doing amounted to malapportionment. Right, that's a misappropriation of people where the districts weren't the same size, and we eventually, out of Baker versus Carr, got to this idea of one person, one vote. Every district is supposed to be approximately equal in population. All right, moving on to our last two questions for the day. We got Shaw versus Reno. All right, what's going on? What are the facts of Shaw v. Reno? First off, this takes place in the state of North Carolina. All right, North Carolina was drawing its districts in an attempt, right, to benefit minority populations, all right, specifically African American populations, right? They were sued by some citizens of the state because they believed, all right, that this amounted to racial discrimination, reverse discrimination, because the districts, the odd shapes were being drawn, weren't motivated by political parties, which is all great and good under gerrymandering, but they called it into question on whether or not this was okay in regards to race being the only factor. What the Supreme Court said in Shaw versus Reno in the 1990s is, looking at the 14th Amendment and Equal Protection Clause, is they said that race cannot be the only factor that is determining how districts are being drawn. Right? It can be a factor in the drawing of districts, but it cannot be the overwhelming factor, very similar to all kind of affirmative action rulings they had that we'll see in the next unit. Okay, that was today's discussion for the legislative branch in Unit 2. All right, I will wrap up Unit 2 with executive and judicial branch on Thursday. Hope you guys are all doing well. Talk to you soon.